My workshop, it's a kind of workshop because actually there are some questions that you can answer, but it's really a workshop that is meant for teachers and to more or less show how teachers can develop critical thinking and citizenship skills through the analysis of historical sources in students. So it's more of a mixture. Let's say it's a workshop for teachers, and also some of the parts that you'll see can also be applied in the classroom in a different format. Okay? Okay, for all that is there, what's really important is that I'm a teacher. For 6 years now, I'm the president of the Portuguese History Teachers Association. I'm also very concerned with the teaching of citizenship, that from the next year on in Portugal, it will be mandatory for all the students from all the years that make the curricula. Okay? And there is a strong recommendation from the part of the Ministry of Education that should be the history teachers the ones to give citizenship classes. Also philosophy teachers, but as you know, philosophy teachers also in Korea, I suppose, they are only on secondary level, and geography teachers too, if there are no history teachers available. Okay? I think we all agree mainly and principally with the last bit. Okay, so I had a short version a while ago because because I had a little time, so here I had a slightly longer version. These are how did I come to be concerned with this issue? One fact that I was a teacher for 7 years in a school in the center of Lisbon, where there were 30-something nationalities, different nationalities. Lots of these kids are coming. There are a lot of Chinese kids, Ukrainians, Russians, etc. So coming from Europe and Asia, but also, and of course, because Portugal was a colonial power, a lot of kids coming from the Portuguese ex-colonies. So I mean, basically African kids. Also from Brazil, but that was a colony a very long time ago, so it doesn't count as an ex-colony. Talking about Angola, Mozambique, and Portuguese Guinea. And so, of course, in Cape Verde, sorry. Okay, so I'm also an author of textbooks, and since the beginning of the construction of these textbooks, me and my colleagues, we are 3, were very worried about the way the Africans are portrayed in most Portuguese textbooks, meaning they are basically portrayed as slaves. Okay? And this is just an example, just for you to be able to see 2 pages and then the following ones of the textbook we made. So, for instance, one of the questions, there are several, I just chose these 2 because they have different approaches. One explained the high mortality rate verified among slaves, and the second one, it's more to do with the environment and worries about the environment, which is not meant to be developed here. But as I said, if we notice here, we can see that it's unavoidable to talk about the Africans in Lisbon, particularly. Just to remind you that in the 16th century, 10% of the population of Lisbon was composed by slaves. Not only black slaves, but also from Asia. Fairly enough, I just read that there were something like 600 Japanese slaves, for instance. And also, so the Portuguese really traded everywhere, and also, to be fair also the Portuguese were enslaved themselves. So it's a world where slavery is current, because we have several examples of Portuguese people that were enslaved in Asia, and also they were enslaved, for instance, by the North African Muslims when the Portuguese ships were captured, for instance. But anyway, this is one page that shows the blacks as slaves. So first, we sought, this is an activity in the end of this chapter that talks about Portuguese expansion, and so talks about the Africans in Portugal, and we thought it's very important to give a positive view of, in this case, Africans, and not show them only as slaves. So there are several sources which show the activities that the black Africans did in the streets of Lisbon or in the houses of rich people, or in other cases, there are other cases, like for instance people that get their freedom And I found a case like that in my research in my neighborhood, because my PhD was about my neighborhood in urban studies. And I found, for instance, a very interesting source that a nun had 2 black slaves, very young girls of 17, and when she died, she left them all a fortune, all her property, and they were able then to become free and marry Portuguese middle rank from the nobility. Because of course, if you had money, it didn't matter anymore. So it's all a question of social position. We also thought it was very important to show that Portuguese people themselves have been, if we can say this expression, if we can use this expression, in their blood, African blood. Because since Roman times, there are Africans in Iberia and in all of Europe. So they just intermingled with the local populations, obviously. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So this is an example. This is a small statue found in, I think, I can't read here, I don't want to lie to you. I think it was found in a tomb, a Roman tomb. And also from the Muslim period. This is an example of a man that was a high-rank Muslim officer during the Muslim occupation or after the Muslims conquered Iberia. And also here it's an example of a letter of freedom, of when the owner freed the slave, generally in the end of their lives, or when they were able to buy their freedom themselves, because most people think slaves didn't get a salary, but actually they did get a salary. The big umbrella that really covers this workshop, this lesson, this mixture of workshop lesson, is the word freedom. And what is freedom? And so for us, it's for a Portuguese student. He will have studied twice in his years of study. This revolution, I don't know if you studied it or not, the French Revolution of 1789, probably not, because it's another cultural area, it's another civilizational area. So for us, it's the mother of all revolutions. And the question is if it's also the mother of freedoms. And I'll give you the answer immediately. Yes, it is, because, of course, it establishes liberté, égalité, fraternité, which in English translates like equality, freedom, and fraternity. And the French Revolution is important for us in this case of the citizenship studies and the study of freedom in general, because after the French Revolution, this declaration was issued in the 26th to the 27th of August of 1789, Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And the Article 1 states, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. And why is this important? It's important because it's one of the main documents, one of the main sources that is going to be used by the men that in 1948, men and women that in 1948 are going to write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Just see the difference here because it's important for what is following. Now, 1948, human rights. In 1789, rights of men and citizens. And then here would come the first question that you have in front of you, that I suppose you could answer now already. Why is the French Revolution of 1789 considered to be the mother of freedoms? So you could use this with students. I don't know if you want to answer, but I think it's a bit silly to answer. So let's move on. But this was, if we had more time, we would do all these, but I don't think we have time to do to answer all these questions by writing. So, but feel free to say anything you want, whenever you want. And just think about this statement there. Slavery in France was not abolished in 1789 when the revolution happened. It was abolished in 1794 and reinstated, 1794 and reinstated in 1802 by Napoleon. I can tell you by pressure of the big, the people that had plantations in South America, namely in the Caribbean islands. They pressured very much the French government to reinstate the slavery, which was never actually abolished. Now we could ask a question to the kids, which is also here in your papers. Two questions actually. Why is the black man in this allegory, why is the black man holding the Declaration of the Rights of Man? And what is that rule doing, this stick doing over the heads of these two people? And also this goes on with it, it's more or less the same. It's the black man that is holding the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. So he has full rights too. It's the statement of this picture. They are equal and he has full rights as the white man has from then on. although, of course, as we know, this was never reality. And actually you have then two sources, you can see, I'm not going to talk about them, but you have two small sources that show you exactly one from 1794 that abolished slavery and the one from 1802 that reinstates slavery. Okay, now go back, think of what we've seen, and think of Declaration of Rights of Men and Citizen. And what about women? Were they citizens? Were they equal to men? No. See, Declaration of the Rights of Men and Citizens. And see, the 1948 Declaration of the Human Rights that already includes women. So, women were out of the picture. And so this extraordinary woman called Olympe de Gouges, a very educated, well-educated woman, she's on the scene at this time, at this point, and she writes a lot. She has a lot of meetings with intellectuals in Paris, and she decides to write in 1791 the Declaration of the Rights of Women. And the first article states, woman is born free and lives equal to men in her rights. And here I always stop and ask the students, do you think women are equal to men in Portugal? And they say, yes. Immediately. I mean, nowadays, of course. And then I say, well, think 80% of your, more or less 80% of your teachers are female, are women, and only 20% are men, but basically the majority of the principals in this country are men. Also, think how many politicians, actually, there are more highly educated women in Portugal than men. There are something like 70 to 80%, and it's getting worse. So really, basically, 30% of men have a high degree of education, and the majority of the high degrees in education belong to women. Although they are not seen in politics, they are seen in politics, of course, but there is no parity, there is no 50-50. So, all these questions to make reference to the present time, to make them think, because they think, oh, the present is perfect, everybody is free, everybody can say whatever they want, the past was like this, but nowadays it's not like that anymore. And then I make another parenthesis and say, let's read what Olympe de Gouges wrote, which is there in Korean anyway. I'm going to read it in English, but you have, on the side of the picture, you have it in Korean. Why are the blacks enslaved? The color of their skin is an insignificant difference. There is no disagreement between day and night, the sun and the moon, or between a starred sky and a dark one. Everything is variety. That is the beauty of nature. Why destroy the work of nature? She wrote this 1 year before the revolution. So we can see that even now, even today, there is a very strong connection, a very strong relationship between women's rights and abolitionism and other issues of parity and justice. Because Olympe de Gouges was worried with actually, if you see the date, before she was worried with women's rights, she was worried with the rights of the enslaved. And that brings us to the second question that you see here on this page. I think it's in the same order in Korean. Do you think there is a connection between abolitionism and women's rights? Justify your answer. And most of the kids won't get there without her help, but some will. And then the following question is, what do you think it happened to Olympe de Gouges? What do you think it happened to her? If you know French, you'll know the answer. Because this is a book about her. It's a biography written by Olivier Blanc. And it says, from the rights of I was going to read in French, from the rights of women to the guillotine. She lost her head because of that. She was considered by the men that made the revolution during the period of terror that followed the revolution, to be a dangerous element for the society because of what she was saying, writing, and screaming around publicly. If she had maintained herself to closed circles, it would not be a problem. But she went public, and so she had to be shut up. And the way to shut her up was literally to cut her head. So now let's go back to Lisbon. And here we have Lisbon in the 16th century. And this image is here for a reason. I always ask to the students, and I ask you, what kind of black Africans do you see in the picture? You see a lot. You see, it's difficult to begin, but you see a lot of them. Here, 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 here. Let's not forget 10% of the population were slaves. What do you think it was their place in the social structure? We know already that there were a lot of slaves, so most of them would be servants, serving noble houses. Some of them served the city. There was a senate that ruled the city of Lisbon, and they also, for instance, there was a body of policemen that were black Africans, because they chose very big, strong black Africans. They had sticks to beat on people that were making disorder in the streets. They had a lot of occupations. But the important thing, and going back to that positive image that we have to transmit to the African kids that we have in our classrooms, you can see here a man, a black man, sitting in a horse. You think a slave would be sitting in a horse? And plus, he has here a cross of Christ. He belonged to the Order of Christ, which is the highest order of chivalry in Portugal. So this wouldn't be given to a slave, for sure. There are several hypotheses. The one that is more credible, probably, Portugal by this time had very good relationship with the Kingdom of Congo, and the king of Congo accepted Christianity, Catholicism in this case. And so it's probably an envoy, probably a prince, a high-ranked prince from Congo that came to Lisbon, because we have in the sources information about this. So that came to Portugal, studied in Portugal, and became, and later on, because he was very close to the court and the high nobility, he became then, he was probably given properties, and he belonged to the aristocracy. So the purpose of this image, the main purpose, of course it can be exploited in many other ways, it's to show to African kids, because their image, I've heard them for many years, because I had a lot of, as I said in the beginning, a lot of African kids as students. They always think they are portrayed in a very unfair way in textbooks, in history textbooks. First, there is very little information about the history of Africa before the arrival of the Portuguese, and it had a rich history. And second, they are always portrayed as the slaves, as the underdog, as this exploited. And so this shows them that reality is black and white, but there are shades of gray in between. And then I tell them, let's go to your textbook and let's see what's there. And in most textbooks, there is this myth of Portuguese textbooks. Portugal was one of the first countries in the world to abolish slavery in 1761. And then we go, I have not here the sources because it would make no sense for you, but we can see the original sources, what they say, what the sources from 1761, what this law says. And what the law says in 1761 is that no more slaves enter in Portuguese territory, and it's called the freedom in the womb. All the female slaves that had a baby in their womb, from that moment on, the baby would be free, but not the parents. So it's a lie. It's just a way of feeling good. But you don't know how difficult it is to change this, because when we, Portuguese Teachers Association, we made at some point a memorandum that we published on the internet on our site saying this, there were some very angry emails to us saying, you are not right, you are taking one of our biggest assets away. To cut a long story short, there are a lot of decrees. Only in 1869 slavery was abolished in all of the Portuguese territories. So it was abolished in Portugal itself by the end of the 18th century. It was only abolished in the colonies in 1869. But then another thing came in substitution, forced labor, which Koreans know a lot about it. So forced labor was applied in all the Portuguese territories. And actually I come from one of those. I come from Angola because my parents were colonists. The matter of the fact is that only in 61 or 62, I can't remember the precise date, I think it's 62, forced labor was abolished in the Portuguese territories. 1962, only in 1962. So the official story in textbooks is we were one of the first countries to abolish slavery. The real story is we were one of the last countries to abolish slavery. After us, only the United States, I think, and Brazil. And after that, we applied forced labor, and we were the last colonial power to abolish forced labor. Portugal was the first state in the world to perform a global slave trade. Between 1450 and 1900, Portuguese ships transported around 11 million people. Now I say to them, let's look at the textbooks, in this particular case this one, and see what this textbook says about the Portuguese colonization. And look at this. 2016, this was published in 2016. The Portuguese aimed to establish peaceful and friendly relationships with the Africans. In Congo, a good relationship was established. We know it's true, but that's not the whole truth. The king of Congo converted to Catholicism. Missionaries had an important task. They spread Christianity and they built schools. The Jesuits did everything, the Portuguese did everything. I mean, who built the schools were the Africans, of course, and the African king permitted that to be so. And also note the lack of critical thinking from the part of the authors of this textbook. They say, missionaries had an important task to spread Christianity, as if to export Christianity is a very important task, and as if the people there didn't have their own religion and needed Christianity. I mean, this comes from a strange point of view. So then I ask freedom, what is it? What is it after all this bit that we've seen? And then most of the kids, I had this lesson modified, of course, in one of your high schools, and immediately one kid said, I asked freedom, what is it? And he said, freedom is being able to do everything I want and speak whatever I want. And I thought that was very interesting because that's exactly the same answer that Portuguese students will give immediately, to do whatever I want. And then, of course, I asked this Korean kid, as I asked to my students, do you really think so? And can you cry fire in a crowded cinema or theater? And this, oh, yes, no, because, of course, if you do that, a crowded theater full of people, you cry fire, you might provoke a lot of damage, dead people and wounded people. Okay, so going back to this question of freedom, after having asked what freedom is, I asked them, what do you think are I say, in 1941, the President of the United States, Roosevelt, prepared the ground for the declaration that then comes in 1948 and talks about the 4 essential freedoms. And I asked my students, what are the 4 essential freedoms? They say a lot of things, but they all, without failing, they all say freedom of speech. It's quite interesting. It's the most important for all of them. This exercise then, it's slightly different from the order that it's here because it didn't make sense for you to present it this way. So how I do it, I present first the images and then the written text. And I ask them to identify, looking at the images, what they think each image, which freedom each image represents. And after that, I also ask them to tell me, or to write down, or to discuss amongst them, what do they think is the most persecuted freedom around the world and why. Okay, so here are the 4 freedoms. I also always tell them the last one, the 4th one, probably wouldn't be there if we weren't in 1941. And it's in a context of war, so freedom from fear, it's very related to that situation, to that global situation. So here are the 4 images, and so each one, freedom of speech, worship, want, and from fear. And then I ask them generally, can you tell me, do you think if this freedom from want is not the most important one in a way? I generally tell them, don't you think if you are hungry, it's quite difficult to think about any other freedom. I mean, so, and then we'll come back to this. Then I go back to Portugal, and because the freedom of speech is the one that they relate the most with and the one they speak most about. And I say, were we always free? Are we free nowadays? And they say, yes, we are free, totally free. We were always free. And I say, come on, I know for you a 50-year-old person is like a dinosaur. But we had a dictatorship between 1926 and 1974, and you know that the freedom of speech was the most affected freedom of all. Then I asked them, can you tell me what this image represents? I'm not going to ask to you, otherwise we won't finish on time. But anyway, so this is an image they never guess. This is an image, it's written here in Portuguese, imprensa, which means press. And so it was an image that was going to be published, if I'm not wrong, in 1927 or 1931, I can't remember the exact date, in a Portuguese newspaper. And of course the censors, that you know all about in Korea too, came because there were a lot of newspapers by then in Portugal. Some of them had 2 editions, morning and afternoon edition. And before going to the print and before coming to the public, they had to go to the censors. And the censors are known as the men of the blue pencil, because for no reason known to men, nobody knows why, they always used blue to cut to censorship the news or the images. And so this is an image of the press tied. And so it was forbidden. It was meant to go on a page of a newspaper, and it was forbidden. The cuts were so drastic, and so that sometimes the journalists were furious because they didn't know they had to fill up the white blanks with something. because otherwise the newspaper would look silly. So one day in a protest, one newspaper decided to publish an edition of newspaper with all the white blanks, without anything. So that was a big scandal. And of course, immediately after that, the government issued a law. There are the white blanks are not allowed. No. So then we go back a bit, and then I asked them, look at this. You can press again, please. Look at this map, and remember the freedom of want, from want. And I asked them, there are exceptions, but if you look at the colors, where are the freest countries in the world regarding all the freedoms, but especially the freedom of speech? Where are they situated? In the poor world or in the rich world? And they immediately get the connection between the freedom of want and the state of the freedom in the world. Because if you notice, apart from India and some South American countries, it's more or less obvious. Of course, then I go and say, it's a little joke for them. You think you are very free in Portugal? And they say yes. And it just happened that there are some discussions now about what is politically correct or not, how the words you should use to define certain realities, if you should have statues if you should have a museum. For instance, in Lisbon, there is a big discussion of a museum of discoveries, or should have another name, etc. And of course, this brings us to this issue that, if you don't mind to translate, I forgot to tell you that you should be careful of what you say in this debate about freedom of speech. This, I say to them, this represents the censorship that we exert one to the other. I mean, personal, individual. And then to end up, I always show them this, which they think also it's not a reality that they know in Portugal, but they might have heard of. And you know, this is a Portuguese publicity from International Amnesty. I don't know if it's Portuguese or Brazilian, actually. I'm not entirely sure. But anyway, this is what happens, I say, for instance, in countries like China, Iran, Russia, etc. You use Twitter, but what happens in these countries is that your tweets might end up like that. Okay? And then I ask them, does this happen in Portugal? And they say, no, of course not. And they say, well, sometimes, not talking about the censorship that is exerted on Facebook by Facebook itself, we also have the censorship that we ourselves do to the others. And so when we don't like somebody said something we don't like, what do we do on Facebook? I don't know if you've done that yourselves, but lots of people have done, I'm sure. We just block the person. We don't like what the person is saying, we block it, and it's not our friend anymore. And so I tell them, you are also exerting a form of censorship, because you are not allowing that person to express herself. And this is the end. Thank you. Thank you very much.